The goal of the 19th is really to change the conversation around how we talk about women and LGBTQ people in politics.
We are firm believers that all issues are women's issues. Our readers are people who want to be better informed and better able to participate in democracy.
We're aiming to change the future of American journalism by giving women and the LGBTQ community the platform and the voice that they deserve.
There's never been a better moment than right now.
The 19th is the newsroom that we've been waiting for.
Hello, and welcome to Live with the 19th. I'm Emily Ramshaw, the co-founder and CEO of the 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom that aims to empower you with the information, resources, and community you need to be equal participants in our democracy. The Americans with Disabilities Act is just over 30 years old. It was last updated in 2010. Since then, the ways we live and work have changed significantly. For Disability Pride Month, we're talking to leaders with disabilities about what it will take to deliver on the promise of the ADA. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, the Ford Foundation, for making this event possible. Here to share a few words is Rebecca Coakley, the Foundation's Program Officer for U.S. Disability Rights. Rebecca?
Hello, my name is Rebecca Coakley, and I have the privilege of being the U.S. Disability Rights Program Officer at the Ford Foundation. I have achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. I have shoulder-length red hair, a glorious abundance of freckles that have traversed 3 generations in my family. I am sitting in my home office. I'm wearing a black Kathy Woods blazer and a gray Ableism is Trash t-shirt from Alice Wong. When the ADA was passed in 1990, full participation, economic self-sufficiency, independent living, and equality of opportunity were a long way off for the disability community. Media plays a key role in the realization of these goals. It has always been a dream of mine to see disability issues covered at mainstream outlets because disability issues affect everyone and people with disabilities are everywhere. Years ago, I reached out to a major media outlet and asked them to cover disability issues more centrally. Like they covered race, gender, LGBTQIA identity, immigration issues. And they said, but we do. It's under the weird news tab. But luckily, this is a different day, and we have leaders like my friend Emily Ramshaw and Amanda Zamora. The 19th leadership in this space has been essential, and we at the Ford Foundation are proud to support your work to ensure coverage of people with disabilities is no longer segregated on the page or in the real world. I think about how powerful it is for a young person with a disability who may be early on in their path to forming an identity, not having to struggle to find stories that represent them, people like them. Or a disabled woman trying to access information on how the Dobbs decision will impact her access to medication. Or the mom who's caregiving for both her parents and her kids, trying to figure out how to make it all work. The 19th's dedication to disability coverage goes a long way to combating the otherizing of people with disabilities and disability concerns. With that, I'm so pleased to wish the team at the 19th a happy and wonderful ADA Day. We are so eager and excited to see where you go from here. And I'm so excited for you to continue to hear from my friends, Maria Town and Senator Tammy Duckworth. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just a reminder that while sponsors and supporters help keep the 19th events free to attend, they play no part in the programming of these conversations. We hope you'll join the conversation online today using the hashtag #the19thlive. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our free newsletter, you can do that now at 19thnews.org/subscribe, where you can find out about upcoming 19th events, read our incredible journalism, and more. Now, let's get started. First, we're talking with U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth, Democrat of Illinois. She's an Iraq War veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and former Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Sara Luterman, caregiving reporter at the 19th, will interview the senator. Sara?
Thank you for joining us today, Senator Duckworth.
It's good to be on. Thanks for having me.
You've been active in advocating for improvements in web accessibility so disabled people can have equal access to online information and services. The internet was in its infancy back in 1990 when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, and compliance with the law and what that means has changed a lot over the past few years in particular. What are some of the changes that you've seen while in office and that you've advocated for?
Well, actually, it's a process over the years. I remember recovering at Walter Reed as a soldier. One of my fellow wounded warriors had lost his vision, lost his eyesight. And that was right at the time that iPhones were coming out and everything was touchscreen. So he went from a cell phone that he could use with buttons on it to one that he couldn't use at all. And it was really frustrating for him until, the Siri technology took over and the voice commands actually started working. And that really taught me in person the real challenges that people face. And for a while, I couldn't use my right arm, so I had to use dictation software, as part of my recovery. And so, as just someone who uses government web pages a lot, it was really frustrating to me to see that 30 years and after the passage of the ADA, we still are not fully compliant. And we've had time to figure this out. We can figure out how to make shopping easier. Why can't we figure out how to consistently across all of government make it, the interaction between government and people more accessible for everyone?
That actually brings me into my next questions, which is that, the ADA is 32 years old at this point, as of July. Part of why Disability Pride Month is in July is because that's the anniversary of when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. A lot of our country is still really inaccessible. This can be in small ways, like if I go to a new restaurant that just opened and with a friend and they're in a power chair and there's just a couple steps to get into the restaurant. It means we can't go to the restaurant. But then there's also bigger and more dangerous sorts of inaccessibility. Especially around things like disaster preparedness, or I know I read that right now the January 6th hearings are going on, and during the attack, you ended up sheltering in your office because it would have been exceedingly difficult to evacuate with the other senators as a wheelchair user. I guess when I think about people with disabilities, you're probably one of the most powerful people with a disability in government. And so reading that was really a little bit shocking to me. It just feels 32 years later, why are we still facing some of these issues?
Well, the reason we're still facing some of these issues is twofold. One, I think there is a taking for granted that we know, that we are in compliance with the ADA. When you go into any public building and you'll see the signs, this is the shelter in place location for persons with mobility difficulties, right? But when you actually talk to the building management or you talk to the local firefighting department or wherever, or the local police force, they don't know about those locations. So they don't know how many people who live in that apartment building are actually in a wheelchair and what floors will they be. That information is never transmitted. So there is procedurally and on paper, we're meeting the requirements of the ADA, but in reality, it is sadly lacking. And the other reason why we're still having issues is because people actively are fighting to degrade the ADA and push the law and break through the law and push us backwards. So you have, for example, the grocery associations that wanted to basically gut the ADA, realtor associations that wanted to gut the ADA, shopping malls. And so not only do we have this whole issue of compliance with the ADA, but it's really a paper compliance, not a reality compliance. And then you also have active efforts by people to actually gut the ADA. And I feel like we're constantly on the defensive when we should actually be expanding the ADA.
That actually leads directly into my next question, which is, what do you feel that the greatest threats to the Americans with Disabilities Act are right now in 2022? I know in particular, a lot of disability advocates I've spoken with have expressed concern about the Supreme Court and how it might respond to an ADA case.
I agree with you with the Supreme Court with this with this Supreme Court in particular, remember that the Roe v. Wade decision they just handed down is especially devastating for persons with disabilities, whether it is those who rely on treatments that involve embryonic stem cell research, for example, or even for the persons with disabilities who rely on IVF and access to reproductive choice in order, and you lose that. So the Roe v. Wade decision, again, is a decision not about abortion. It's a decision about your privacy rights to have bodily autonomy. And if there is a group of people who are constantly under threat and having their bodily autonomy under threat, it's persons with disabilities. And so, yes, I am very much concerned about where the Supreme Court would go after this Roe v. Wade decision, as sort of a starting point for where they would go. I also think that another danger we have is complacency within our culture, where people just assume that the ADA exists. I mean, I had the same issue with restaurants, right? I was in Chicago, and on the spur of the moment with staff, had a long day, said, let's go have dinner, my treat. We had to call 5 restaurants, and 3 of them didn't even have ADA access. 1 did and said, we're just too busy to deal with that, to go open that door for you. So we ended up with 1 restaurant, and I talked to the Restaurant Owners Association. They were shocked, and I said, well, you may become in compliance on paper, but your membership certainly are not in reality. So complacency is also a real threat to the ADA.
What are some of the ways that we should be working to expand the Americans with Disabilities Act, and how practical is that right now in the current political climate? I know historically the Americans Disabilities Act was very bipartisan, but it seems that in the past few years, disability rights priorities have been progressively less bipartisan.
Well, I think that what we need to understand is that what's become bipartisan is actually opposition to the ADA. So the recent push just a few years ago to basically gut the ADA got Democratic votes in the House. It passed the House. The Education Act passed the House, and I was able to stop it in the Senate. And the reason it passed the House was because a lot of House members, Democratic House members, did not understand the law as it was written, and that this actually was going to gut the ADA. So it actually passed the House. And so the danger here is it's now become bipartisan to support efforts to undermine the ADA. And it's because of that, I think now is the time to be more aggressive than ever. We don't want to just be on the defensive and defend this, try to get back to what the status quo is. We need to be expanding the ADA. For example, we still have public schools in Chicago that are not wheelchair accessible. And so kids with disabilities are essentially warehoused in a single, they're all told to go to this particular school or that particular school as opposed to the school in their neighborhood, which adds commute times, which adds wear and tear and stress on them physically and mentally, for a group of kids who, for example, have a hard time just physically being able to do their homework and do all the normal things. And now you're going to put them on this huge long commute because the local school where they would normally go physically is not accessible. And so we should be on the offensive. I've told the Chicago Public Schools, you got all this American Rescue Plan money, you better be making all your schools accessible. So, I feel I'm an old soldier, right? So for me, it's like when you're in an ambush, the best way to defeat an ambush is to actually go on the offensive. It's time to go on the offensive.
So in addition to being one of the most visible and vocal disabled senators, you're also the first sitting senator in US history to have given birth while in office. And you were also the first senator to cast a vote while holding a baby, which was a very powerful moment just for me as an American woman. What are some specific challenges that parents with disabilities like yourself face, and are there legislative actions that you plan to take to try to protect those rights?
Well, first of all, it's the right to become a parent. So many in the disability communities are questioned, even by their own healthcare providers, whether or not they're capable of becoming parents or that they're capable of even caring for their children. There's no test needed for able-bodied men and women to have children. They just have children. Nobody questions whether or not they can care for their children. and provide loving, good homes for their children. And yet when somebody has a visible disability or even an invisible one, you're questioned right away, like you can't be a good parent. So just the process of becoming a parent is a challenge for persons who live with disabilities. And then when you are a parent, it is difficult if you can't do basic things with your children because if you have a physical disability where you can't access things. I was at a movie theater with my girls for a birthday party when the fire alarm went off, and I had to entrust my two girls to another mom to help them get down the stairs and evacuate while I sheltered in place. That's really scary, and it traumatized my daughters, and I eventually made my way out, and I waited, nobody came, and I just forget about it. I just went down the elevator, and I went and found my girls, and they were very, very upset. And so these are all things that persons with disabilities face when they try to become a parent, and then as parent themselves. You start off with people assuming that you can't be a parent or can't be a good parent simply because of a disability. And then there are all these roadblocks that get in your way all along the way. And frankly, we're better than that as a society. We don't block people's ability to have children because of their race, because of their religious affiliations. Why should we block somebody because of their disability?
Yeah, I mean, I know that's been a major concern also in the fallout from the Dobbs decision, is sort of like reproductive rights for people with disabilities. So you mentioned earlier in the interview, and I guess this will be our last question. You mentioned going on the offensive. What does that look like?
Well, I think it looks like reaffirming the ADA in many different ways. In the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I included the ASAP Act, and I pushed very hard for funds to be set aside for that specifically set up a grant program so that our mass transit systems could become fully ADA compliant. And so, it's not about telling all these transit systems, you have to be ADA compliant. I went on the offensive and actually found a way to fund the programs. And I had to push really hard among leadership and to say, hey, we need this money, and we need to make sure that we fully fund this effort. And even so, of the $15 billion I asked for, a big chunk of it was cut. So I'm going to come back and push for more. But we got enough money to have a good start towards making 100% of the nation's transit stations fully ADA compliant. And by that, I mean not just for physical mobilities, but for cognitive as well, and for vision and hearing as well. And so that's what I mean. It's both strengthening the law and maybe pushing for local level enforcement as well as positive actions you can take, like creating these grant funds that allow local, municipal, and mass transit systems to be able to finally afford to do this.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This was a pleasure, and I'm sorry, I'm really nervous about it.
No worries. It was wonderful. It was good to chat with you.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Such an important conversation. Next, Sara talks to Maria Town, President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. Town served as the director of the City of Houston Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities and was the Senior Associate Director in the Obama White House Office of Public Engagement, where she managed the White House's engagement with the disability community and older Americans. Back to you, Sara.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you, Maria, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited about this event. I know I told you this before the interview, but this is one of the first things that I pitched to the 19th when I joined, and I'm excited that we can finally sit down and do this. So the Americans with Disabilities Act turns 32 this year, but we still have a long way to go towards a society that's accessible and equitable for all Americans. What are some of the biggest civil rights issues facing people with disabilities in 2022?
Where do you want to start? So I actually, one of the things that I've been reflecting upon a lot lately, Sarah, is how hard disabled people have fought to be in public. And when we think about the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA, you know, so much of it is about making places of public accommodations accessible to disabled people. And, you know, it's about our community saying that we have a right to be employed, we have a right to exist in public, and not only exist, but really thrive in public. And I've been thinking a lot about where we are at with the pandemic, where we are at with climate change, where we are at with gun violence, and thinking about how unsafe it is for us to be in public. You know, when so many of us are high risk, including myself, and our communities are saying goodbye to mask requirements and social distancing, and virtual participation is no longer an option. How do we keep pushing for the right to exist in public when being in public is no longer safe? And so in response to that question, and I know that you've talked about this with Senator Duckworth, you know, things like web accessibility and ensuring that remote platforms, including the metaverse, right, and virtual reality, continue to be accessible to disabled people, or become accessible to disabled people, are so important. I also think that we need to be able to know that we can continue living in our homes if that is the environment that we want, and access to home and community-based services, which I know is an issue you've done a lot of reporting on, continues to be of dire need. The institutional bias that exists in Medicaid and Medicare and in all of our healthcare systems is so deeply entrenched into American society that I think the civil rights battle ahead for greater access to HCBS and greater wages for those workers, greater worker protections and protections for HCBS consumers is of vital importance.
So I guess you already touched on this a little bit, but one of the biggest challenges to disabled life in the past few years has been COVID-19. What are some of the ways that the ADA has been adapted to address life in the pandemic? I mean, are there particular use cases that you think stand out, or even ways that the ADA might even have been a little counterproductive?
I wouldn't say that the ADA has been counterproductive at all. I want to note, you know, we focus on the ADA in July because of the anniversary, but the ADA is one of many disability civil rights laws. And so I think during the pandemic, we have seen both the ADA and 504 be used frequently to protect disabled people. And so there are a couple of use cases that I think have been really important, and we need to see continued attention to. A big one is on discriminatory crisis standards of care. And I want to be clear, discriminatory crisis standards of care existed before the pandemic, but it was during the pandemic that I think they were really brought to light and put into action in ways that we had not seen before. So these are policies that states and hospital systems set up that would allow physicians to deny disabled people, older adults, sometimes fat people, and LGBTQIA people access to life-saving care because they were deemed disposable. Those are my words, right? But like in Alabama, they literally named the presence of intellectual disability as a reason to deny someone life-saving care when medical resources were short. And I want to, the disability community has done some incredible, very coordinated organizing on this topic. The Department of Health and Human Services in 2020 through parts of 2021 issued I'm forgetting the technical term for the guidance, but like we're in agreements with some states to end these crisis standards of care, and we still need guidance from these agencies to actually begin to make these illegal and to outlaw them. And I want to note that the crisis we're seeing around healthcare resources right now is less around like access to ventilators and medications, which was the primary concern in the beginning of the pandemic, and more around staffing, because we have a huge healthcare workforce crisis happening. And so the potential that a disabled person, particularly an older disabled person or a disabled person of color, could be denied life-saving care when they get COVID is still very real, because there may not be physicians to treat them. And so what we've seen, the Health and Human Services has issued a frequently asked questions document that says that this is wrong and in violation of Section 1557, the ADA, and Section 504, and that's been really important. There are other examples like visitors, when we saw hospitals basically say that you could not have visitors in hospital settings. There are individuals who may need a support person with them, whether that's a person who's deaf and needs an interpreter, someone who needs a different kind of communication access, or a person with an intellectual or mental health disability who needs a support person to help them navigate a particular setting. And so without the ADA and without other disability civil rights protections that either rely on the ADA or that the ADA is built upon, we wouldn't have any of that. I do think one of the issues that is slightly less dire than the ones I've highlighted have been the issues around sidewalk cafes. Right, COVID happens. People want to continue to go to restaurants, but it's not safe to eat inside. So we see an explosion of these sort of impromptu sidewalk cafes. And that becomes a barrier in accessing the public right of way. And so you then saw municipalities begin to establish like local building ordinances and building codes. And a lot of the standards for those codes actually come from the ADA to ensure continued access to the sidewalk and to the ramp for people with disabilities.
Yeah, definitely tripped over some chairs.
Oh, yeah, I mean, like navigating sidewalks these days, it's become really treacherous for me, because I'm just like, what am I gonna do if there's like a tables, chairs, a whole pavilion with like fake flowers coming off of it, and all I need to do is be able to stay on the sidewalk. And I also don't want to have to walk through people who are unmasked and eating, and yeah.
So I know like the Supreme Court's looming large in people's minds a lot right now. And so I wanted to talk about sort of like some of the threats to the ADA. I'm thinking specifically about concerns that a lot of advocates I've spoken with have about sort of what would happen if an ADA challenge went to the Supreme Court. I remember specifically like CVS v. Doe from last year. And I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit about that as an advocate.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I want to note I'm not an attorney.
Yeah, that's
so what I'm about to say may not be skilled with like technical legal jargon. But with CVS v. Doe, it was this case that involved pharmacies. The way that pharmacies handled specialty pharmacy needs. In this case, it specifically concerned AIDS and HIV, kind of Ryan White program participants. And what would happen is that individuals who needed to get access to these medications, instead of being able to like order them online or use an app, which we've all become accustomed to, they would have to call them in. And it was essentially placing a greater burden on the individuals who needed these medications. That was sort of the gist of the plaintiff's lawsuit. And what CVS questioned in their complaint to the Supreme Court was whether or not disparate impact in 1557 applied to people with disabilities. And one of the things that disparate impact notes is that discrimination does not have to be overt, right? So like overt discrimination is someone basically saying like, oh, Maria, you're one of those people, you're one of those disabled people, we're not going to let you into this building. For most people with disabilities, we know that discrimination can occur even from very well-intentioned people, right? I mean, you could argue that a whole lot of the current institutionalization that still happens is very well-intentioned, right? Oh, we need this specific space to keep these vulnerable people safe. I think that, there's a lot of good intentions there, but of course, it results in harmful discrimination. And we knew that if the Supreme Court, which has historically been hostile to disability rights, that if the Supreme Court were to actually hear this case, it was likely that they would decide that disparate impact did not apply in instances of disability discrimination, which would erode not only the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And one of the things that we're worried about now, especially in light of the Dobbs decision and specifically Clarence Thomas's dissent, is work to erode any rights that are not explicitly named in the Constitution. And so that would include disability rights, women's rights more broadly, LGBTQIA rights around racial and ethnic minorities. I think there's a lot at stake here, and one of AAPD actually worked with CVS to highlight how much was at stake with this particular decision. And while I was frustrated that CVS even went so far as to bring this to the Supreme Court, once we were able to engage in dialogue with them, they got it. And one of the things that we needed to highlight was even, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who at times had great decisions like in Olmstead, right, was at other times extremely hostile to disability rights. And so when you look at this court in this composition, there's no way that you could deny this would not result in harm to the disability community.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just think it's interesting that like the current legislative strategy seems to be sort of like to discourage cases from going to the Supreme Court.
Yep. Well, and I think part of it is, once the Supreme Court reaches a decision, it's very hard. I think, where do I start with this? If you look at like, what's happening in Congress, right? I think the strategy might be different if we sort of knew that Congress was committed to getting things done. And if you look at the sort of political intransigence on the Hill, if the Supreme Court had issued a terrible decision around disability rights, there's not a clear path forward, right? If we were like, okay, let's prepare the legislative vehicle that will fix this, how long would that take to happen, right? And so it was too much of a risk. That strategy of kind of preventing cases from going to the court is one that the disability community has used in the past, which was helpful for me to understand, because when I first educated myself on this issue, I thought there was no way we could get CVS to pull their complaint, but it was through talking with other advocates who had used similar strategies even 20 and 30 years ago. I was like, okay, this is a doable path forward.
Yeah.
And I think it may be a path that other communities take too, especially given what's happening right now.
So that actually sort of keys into my next question, and also something that Senator Duckworth said during her interview. So like historically, disability rights has been pretty bipartisan. The ADA was signed by President Bush Sr. Bob Dole was a longtime AAPD board member.
Bob Dole helped found AAPD.
Yeah. I stand corrected. But I guess something that she said that I thought was really interesting was she said that in a lot of ways, opposition to disability rights has become a bipartisan issue. Like she pointed out that I forget what the bill was called.
The ADA Notification Act.
Yeah, the one that passed the House. The ADA Notification Act, which would have made it more difficult to bring complaints, which is like the only enforcement mechanism for the ADA.
Right.
So I guess like, is disability still a bipartisan issue, and what's changed?
I think that very few issues at this point are truly bipartisan. And I agree with Senator Duckworth that one of the things that is consistently bipartisan has been opposition or stigmatization of disabled people. Another area where we have seen this happen and continue to happen consistently is on mental health and gun violence, right? You have folks from both sides who consistently say, you know, we need to limit people with mental illnesses access to guns, even though people with psychiatric disabilities are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. And so I have to agree with her on that. I think it is tough. It's tough for me to address the first part of your question, because one of the realities of disability advocacy is that most of our advocacy tools exist within nonprofits like AAPD, who have to either be nonpartisan or bipartisan in our work. And so we have to continue to attempt to engage all sides in our fights, and try to do whatever we can to achieve the goals of community integration, you know, an end to ableism, things like that. And, you know, whoever wants to respond to our calls, we're going to welcome them. And, you know, I think one of the questions that I asked myself is, what, you know, state legislatures too are increasingly polarized, but are there champions there we could be looking at? Are there specifically local leaders in the forms of mayors that we could be working with to advance some of our priorities as a community? And like, yes, you know, that's a different way of working than engaging in federal advocacy, but ultimately, and this is one of the sort of issues with the ADA, is that, you know, you have the ADA pass in 1990, but then it's up to the states and local governments to make sure it's implemented. Yeah. And so I do hope that we can build out a strategy that is more focused on state and local in the future, in part so that we are less constrained by the hyper-partisanship and polarization that's happening in Congress right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, disability is kind of a weird issue in a lot of ways. I know this is a point that gets brought up a lot in disability spaces, just that it's something that can impact anybody at any time in their life. Like, anybody can become disabled, anybody can have a disabled child. And so it's sort of like conceptually seems like it should be a broad issue.
Well, and if you look at our voting patterns, we are a like bipartisan community. You know, we don't really talk like that, but the reality is that the presence of disability increases with age, right? We call it aging into disability. And so when people are talking about like older voters who are more likely to be Republican, they're also more likely to be disabled. And so when you look at the disability community's voting patterns, we are very evenly split in our votes for Republican and Democratic candidates. And so I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I think it is a really complex issue. I don't think we do it justice when we solely look at what's happening in Congress, if that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense. And I mean, also just like the more dysfunctional Congress is, the more necessary it is to look for solutions outside Congress.
That's right.
And I guess sort of speaking of like sort of that, the ways that the disability community reflects the broader community, I wrote a story, I think a couple months ago at this point, sort of about a Data for Progress poll about abortion rights in our community, in the disability community. Specifically that it turns out that I guess our voting patterns, our opinions are pretty much the same as the general population, with most people supporting some form of abortion rights in some circumstances. Under your leadership, AAPD took an official position on abortion rights for the first time. Do you feel like as a leader in the disability community, like that, like what was important about taking that step?
So many things.
Sorry.
So many things. No, you're asking these great questions, Sarah. So I want to provide some context, and I know that this is context that you're aware of, but for folks who are tuning in, disability and abortion is an extremely fraught and complex issue. And that is because of concerns around selective abortion, right? And just so you know how personal this is to me, like I've asked my mom to her face, had you known I had cerebral palsy before I was born, what would you have done? And the reason I asked my mother that question is because I was seeing an increase in information about prenatal testing and the ways in which pregnant people were being encouraged to abort fetuses that tested positive with Down syndrome or other disabilities.
Yeah.
And it is tough to ask your mother that question and like not be confident in her response. And my mom was like, "Oh, of course I would have kept you," but it's just like, are you sure of that? I don't know.
I'd honestly be scared to ask my mom that question. I haven't asked that. I'd be like too scared about the answer.
Yeah, no, and Sarah, I mean, that's real. And it probably took me like 2 years of thinking about it to actually get up the courage to ask. And so because of these concerns, there are a significant, what we've seen in the sort of abortion or anti-abortion fights has been a rhetoric of saving children and babies with disabilities from anti-abortion advocates, right? And in my opinion, disabled people have become sort of political pawns in this fight. However, because of the significant number of disabled people who are, and I very strongly identify as pro-life, especially in the intellectual disability community, I think it was very difficult for cross-disability organizations like AAPD to take a position.
Yeah.
And so historically, the answer to that was silence. And I may be misquoting Audre Lorde here, but like, our silence will not keep us safe, right?
Yeah.
And as we, I think part of the reason it was so easy to use disabled people as a political pawn in this fight is in part because we did not have a strong voice on this issue.
Yeah.
And so as we saw what was going to happen with Dobbs, I basically said, we have to say something, and we have to say something now. The stakes are too high. And I'm really proud of the statement that we issued. We were able to say, any ban on abortion is wrong, and bodily autonomy is a core value of the disability rights movement. Bans on abortion strip people of their bodily autonomy, and disabled people have fought for decades to be able to make our own choices about our own bodies. And that may not be about, making a choice to abort a fetus. It may even be a choice to like eat what we want, right?
Yeah.
Also in that statement, we were able to acknowledge that selective abortion is a major issue, but bans on abortion will not address the ableism that ultimately undergirds that concern. And so, we issued this statement. We've done a lot of work with other disability organizations and reproductive justice organizations on this, and have continued to push the Biden administration to do more to protect bodily autonomy for pregnant people or people who could become pregnant. I am relieved to see that the administration issued some recent guidance protecting access to medications like methotrexate, which can be used in treating a miscarriage, but are also used to treat chronic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. And we were seeing people with disabilities who've used these medications for years suddenly get denied access to them because their physicians or pharmacies were afraid of being criminalized as these state bans have taken effect.
Yeah.
So that guidance is happening, thank goodness. I think we need more of that, but yeah, it meant a lot for me personally to be able to issue that statement. And I hope we can do more. I still think there are major questions out there, around things like practical support for disabled people seeking abortion, and if they'll be able to find accessible services, whether that's communication access or accessible clinics. And so much of transportation is not accessible that the idea of going across state lines isn't realistic for many people.
So I want to end try to end on a positive note. I know a lot of disability rights stuff can get really difficult. I mean, it's a fight that's been going on for a long time. What are some of the big wins for the disability rights community and the disability community in general that you think that we've seen in the past few years? Like what gives you like hope for the future?
I do think that getting CVS to pull their complaint from the Supreme Court was a huge win. And like, I feel like bad stuff continues to happen, so we can kind of move on, but like truly we saved the ADA and we saved 504 in that moment, and like, let's celebrate that. I also think this is not policy related, but I do think that we are really seeing media representation of disabled people advance by leaps and bounds. I mean, like, I'm truly not trying to like overly flatter you, but like the fact that you exist at the 19th, Sarah, is like a big deal. And even, just a few years ago, I could not imagine major news outlets like hiring people to cover a disability beat, right? And I think we're seeing more diverse representation, more authentic representation. We've got a ways to go, but even 10 years ago, I could not have like dreamed we'd see some of the stuff we see today. I'm not sure if we really talk about it in that way as much, but it's something that I've noticed and don't want to diminish. I think AAPD does a lot of work with young leaders with disabilities. And, I did not fully embrace my disability identity and pride until like end of college, shortly after I got out of college. And the fact that young folks with disabilities are able to access community, whether it's in person or virtually, and develop disability pride earlier on is really exciting and gives me a lot of hope.
Awesome. Yeah, it gives me a lot of hope too. I definitely, it took me a long time to learn how to love myself, and it's so exciting to see like younger people learning that lesson way earlier.
I mean, it's just like, whoa. And the AAPD interns that we have, I mean, they are pushing us every day, and that's exactly what they should be doing. And I think it's awesome.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Sarah, for such an insightful conversation about disability rights. I appreciate all of you who joined us today, and thank you again to our sponsor, the Ford Foundation, for making this event possible. If you want to be among the first to hear about our upcoming events, you can sign up now at 19thnews.org/subscribe. Finally, thanks to the thousands of 19th members who support our nonprofit newsroom. Your donations truly make conversations like today's possible. If you're not a 19th member yet, we'd love to have you join us at 19thnews.org/membership. We look forward to welcoming you to the 19th family, and we will see you at our next event.